Nā mana, nā reo, e te rahi, e nā matoaka o nā tōpita o te ao. Piki mai, kaki mai, nau mai haere mai, ki tēnei o nā wananga. Whakatau mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, I'm John Fraser, the Dean of the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to our 2019 inaugural lecture series. Over the next 4 weeks, we will be introducing a record number of 8 new professors of the University of Auckland, and I am delighted to say that 4 of these are women. We will shortly be gender equal in terms of our professoriate within the faculty, which is a great achievement. So for those of you who are new to the inaugural lecture, I would like to explain just a little about the ceremonial occasion and why we consider it to be one of the highlights of the academic year. So the process of professorial inauguration serves 2 very important purposes. One is an expression of acknowledgement and congratulations to the new professor on joining the elite circle of the university's professoriate. The second purpose is to showcase the subject and the story, the new professor, to the public. It is the maiden lecture of an academic who has been bestowed with the highest rank of the university. Inaugural lectures date back to medieval times when universities were mostly elite live-in men's clubs. Inauguration into the club was a public event, unashamedly designed to impress the public and rich benefactors about the need for their continued patronage, to ensure that the members enjoyed a lifestyle befitting their status, knowledge and intellect, and of course free from outside interference. Not much has changed. Of course, then professors were chosen primarily for their own financial worthiness or the worthiness of their benefactor, and one of the traditions was that new professors had to entertain all of their professorial colleagues at their own personal expense for the entire duration of the inaugural period. I'm pleased to say, Cathy, that we now pay for the food and drinks. No, but promotion to professor is actually a very serious business. An appointment is achieved only after decades of work as a teacher, mentor, researcher, writer, and significant service to the local and international community. The selection process involves intense scrutiny from international peers who confirm to the university that the appointee meets the required level of international eminence in their chosen field. These lectures, of course, are a wonderful opportunity for colleagues, family and friends to share in the journey that has led to the success. Tonight it is my very great pleasure to introduce our first lecture for this year, Professor Cathy Stinear, who will present a lecture on predictions and unicorns, personalising stroke rehabilitation. She would not tell me what unicorn meant. But first, I would like to invite Professor Alan Barber to the rostrum to provide an introduction to Professor Stinear.
Just over 10 years ago, when I was appointed the Neurological Foundation Professor of Clinical Neurology, Ian Martin and Dick Bellamy, who were the Deans of the Faculties of Medical and Health Sciences and Science, approached me to see if we could find a home for Cathy as a senior lecturer alongside me in the Department of Medicine. Unbeknownst to me, Cathy had been offered a position in the United Kingdom, and they were keen that she stayed in New Zealand. This was a little unusual in that Cathy is a neuroscientist, something that we often forget. And the Department of Medicine, at least in those days, was, with a few exceptions, full of medical doctors. But Cathy and I had research interests in common. We'd already worked together, and there was a high level of trust between us, and so she moved in. Over the first few months, I became increasingly impressed with her intellect and her formidable organisational skills. I can distinctly recall talking to Philippa Paul. I don't know if Philippa's here. Philippa was head of the Department of Medicine at that stage during a performance review, and telling Philippa that this woman is going to be my boss one day. She's now deputy head of the Department of Medicine, and it was with some pleasure that I got my latest application for CME leave approved by her earlier today. I wonder if that's a conflict of interest, but it became very clear very quickly that good things would come from this research partnership. We talk a lot about bridging the gap between scientists and clinicians and translating neuroscience into clinical care, but Kath is actually doing this on a day-to-day basis. She established the Clinical Neuroscience Laboratory located across the road in the hospital, because that's where the sick people are, and she and her team are deeply embedded in the stroke unit, and they're on the wards on a daily basis. And it would come as a surprise to many of the people around that they are scientists. One of the other great things that happened is that Kath came as a package deal. With her partner Winston Byblow and father Jim Stinear, and together the four of us have worked extensively together and published quite a lot together. It's been fantastic. Along the way, Kath has made research magic, and her outputs speak for themselves. She has a total of 111 publications with over 4,000 citations. She's a named investigator on grants totaling $37 million, around 4 million of those as a principal investigator. She's on the editorial board of Stroke, which is the Stroke Bible. She's on the Council of the Neurological Foundation of New Zealand and chairs its Scientific Advisory Committee, and many of us here today have received funding from the foundation with Kath as the chair. She supervised 8 research fellows, 4 research therapists, and these are therapists that have given up time, a year, say for example, of their DHB work time to move into the university to do research. She's supervised or co-supervised 14 PhD students, 6 MSc students, and 10 BSc or BSc Honours or biomedical science students. And she's done all of this in just over 10 years, which is a remarkable achievement. But her greatest achievement has been ensuring that her research doesn't just sit in the journals in which it's published, but it's translated into clinical care and implemented into clinical practice. And one of her, I'm sure we'll hear, one of her interests is implementation research. And by doing this, she's ensuring that our lives of our patients are improved. Kath, it's been a pleasure working with you over the past 10 years. Congratulations on your well-deserved appointment to Professor and this, your inaugural lecture.
Gosh, thank you so much, John and Alan, for those kind remarks. There you are, for those kind remarks. No wonder I feel so tired, Alan. Crikey. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm just back a bit from the microphone, but this way I can actually see you all properly. So before we get to predictions and stroke rehabilitation, and yes, the occasional unicorn, I'd just like to share a little bit of my story and how I got here. I'm a true Aucklander, having been born and raised in Avondale and then living in Orewa when me and my family returned after 3 years in the States, and then moving to Manarewa for my high school years. Yeah, I've been around Auckland. After running away with the circus and then dropping out halfway through 7th form, no, true story, I lived in Tauranga, Palmerston North and Australia. And now I'm lucky to live here in St Heliers. having lived west, north, south, and now east, I think I've got Auckland surrounded, and I feel very lucky to call this place home. When I dropped out of high school, I swore I would never go to university. And here we are. Just goes to show, right? You can't be too sure of yourself at 17. My high school classmates were all going to university to study law and medicine, and architecture and accounting, but I was itchy for adventure. Our Prime Minister at the time was David Lange, and he had just really annoyed the senior brass in the Air Force by saying they should really consider training women as fighter pilots, because at the time, women as pilots were mainly involved in transport and search and rescue. Now, the media around this really appealed to my feminist sensibilities, and so I applied for the Air Force. But I didn't get far because of my history of asthma. My parents, though, were hugely generous and supported me through civil aviation training. I got my commercial pilot's licence and was a flying instructor at just 19. Knowing what I know now about brain maturation, that is totally irresponsible. Totally. But it felt great at the time, particularly teaching aerobatics in the calm, quiet dawn over the Hunter Valley in Australia. This was actually my first experience of teaching, and it's not that different from what I do today. Helping people from a variety of backgrounds become competent and confident through supervision and mentoring continues to be a really enjoyable and rewarding part of my work. Thankfully, the responsibilities involved in flying were exactly the growing up experience I needed at the time. But it kind of is glorified bus driving, and I did need another challenge. So I enrolled in the first cohort of students at New Zealand's first and only College of Chiropractic. This meant enrolling in university too, and at 23, with some life experience on board, I was finally ready. It didn't take me long though, after 5 years of training and being self-employed in practice, to realise that, okay, most of these problems are variations on a theme, and I was still hungry for more challenge. And by this stage, I'd been bitten by the neuroscience bug, so I enrolled in a master's, which turned into a PhD here at the University of Auckland. Ideally, a PhD gives you the ability to both ask and answer your own questions, and I think that's a real gift. So science is my third career, or fourth if you count the circus, and I finally found the thing that I want to keep doing. It's impossible to get bored when you're creating new knowledge, especially when you're doing that working as part of a team and working on problems that really matter. My doctoral studies were actually on a movement disorder called focal hand dystonia. This is a rare and very disabling condition that at least some of you will know quite a lot about. It can take the form of writer's cramp or musician's cramp, and it's called the yips when it affects sports people. The experience I gained working with patients in a research context now instead of a clinical one, and using non-invasive brain stimulation techniques, put me in a really good position to be involved in a range of research activities. These have included some really interesting projects with colleagues and students, such as Nick Gant and Claire Turner in exercise sciences, looking at the effect of carbohydrate in the mouth on motor system excitability. Winston Byblow, James Coxon, Hayley MacDonald, looking at response inhibition and the effect of dopamine agonists. Grant Searchfield and Raj Shekhawat, looking at using those non-invasive brain stimulation techniques as a treatment for tinnitus. Suresh Muthukumaraswamy and Kate Godfrey, again looking at non-invasive brain stimulation for people with treatment-resistant depression. Andrew McDade and Sarah Ward in engineering, testing a new type of walking training device for people after stroke. Tor Bezier in bioengineering, looking at modelling the gait patterns of people with stroke. And Ralph Buck, great picture, Ralph Buck from dance studies, along with his student Kate Regel van West, and together we carried out the first study in the world to look at the effects of learning poi on cognitive and physical well-being amongst older adults. I'll bet you didn't see that coming. Neither did I, to be honest. It's been a real pleasure working with these colleagues and their students. Variety really is the spice of life. But my main focus is on stroke. As many of you know, stroke affects around 10,000 people each year in New Zealand. It's a leading cause of adult disability, and there are two main kinds. The first kind on the left is an ischemic stroke, and that's where a blockage occurs in an artery somewhere in the brain. The other kind is a hemorrhagic stroke, and that's where one of those blood vessels bleeds inside the brain. In both situations, the cells downstream are deprived of essential oxygen, and so their function is seriously disrupted, and this usually produces some permanent neurological impairments. Movement is commonly affected by stroke, with patients experiencing weakness and a loss of fine motor control on one side of their body. As a freshly hatched movement neuroscientist, I was hired to work on a clinical trial with patients who'd experienced stroke at least 6 months prior and had ongoing hand and arm weakness. The trial tested a device for priming the brain before hand and arm therapy, and it was funded by the Health Research Council. This was an amazing opportunity for me to coordinate a randomised controlled trial and upskill in brain imaging techniques. It was also the first time that Alan, Winston and I worked on a project together, and so this was really the beginning of what's become a very successful and exciting collaboration. From here, I could tell you about the positive results of this trial and the studies that came after it, but I'm going to take you on a side journey instead. Something I noticed during this study was that people's response to therapy at the chronic stage of stroke depended on a key motor pathway in the brain. It's the purpley blue one in this picture, and this is called the corticospinal tract. It's essential for fine motor control, particularly of the hand. We used two techniques to test this connection. One was magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, similar to this, to measure how much structural damage the stroke had done to this tract. We were actually among the first to put patients into the scanner in what was then the new Centre for Advanced MRI here at the University of Auckland. We were all on a pretty steep learning curve, that's for sure. The other technique is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. This is a safe, painless and non-invasive technique to activate neurons near the surface of the brain. You can see here that we just hold an insulated coil against the scalp. When it fires, it creates a very brief magnetic field which passes painlessly through the scalp and the skull, and that activates the underlying neurons. These neurons fire, and when we hold it over the movement areas, they send a message down to the spinal cord via that corticospinal tract. That message then goes out to muscles on the opposite side of the body. So we can use this technique to test whether we can still get a message through from the stroke side of the brain out to the weak hand and arm muscles on the other side of the body. If we can, we see a response like this in the surface EMG recordings from the hand and arm muscles. This is called a motor evoked potential, or MEP, and the presence of this evoked potential indicates that the tract is still working. If it's not working and we don't see a response, and it's damaged past a certain point, this will severely limit the use of the hand. This is actually a really simple concept, but this study was the first time that TMS and MRI biomarkers had been used together to understand individual patients' response to therapy. We published these findings in Brain, and I'd just like to acknowledge James Coxon, who was a PhD student on this project and is now a senior lecturer at Monash University, and also Melanie Fleming, who was a master's student on this project and is now a postdoctoral research fellow at Oxford. In this report, we also published what was the embryonic version of the PrEP2 algorithm that we use today, and I'll tell you more about this shortly. But here's the very beginnings of where we've landed. For now, just notice that we put TMS and MRI into a decision tree to make predictions and guide rehabilitation for individual patients. And that's still the central theme of much of the work I do today, more than 10 years later. This study has actually been cited nearly 700 times, and it led to me being invited to give a keynote in the Presidential Symposium at the World Stroke Congress, and that in turn led to an invitation to write a review for the Lancet Neurology. I think this is really good going for what was basically a side project. And it just goes to show that it's not always the main event where you find all the action. The review gave me the chance to refine some of my ideas and propose a version of the algorithm that could be used with patients within days of stroke. And it looked like this. The main difference from the one that we developed with chronic patients is that it starts with a simple clinical assessment of strength in the stroke-affected arm. SAFE stands for shoulder abduction, which is that movement, and finger extension, which is that movement. And the strength of each of these two movements is graded out of 5 using a simple clinical assessment. Those two scores are then added together for a SAFE score out of 10. This is done within 3 days of stroke symptom onset, and if the person scores at least an 8 out of 10, they're expected to make what we called at the time a complete recovery of hand and arm function. This is a bit of a misnomer, really, but you do live and learn. Notice that TMS and MRI are only used if needed, and it's the hierarchical nature of this decision tree that makes it more efficient. It means you don't have to use every test with every patient. So this was the idea, and we needed to test it. Around this time, I joined the Department of Medicine as a senior lecturer based in the hospital across the road. We were actually running a second trial of the device funded by the HRC, this time with patients within the first couple of weeks after stroke. And this created the perfect opportunity to test the algorithm to see if it could predict how well a person would recover hand and arm function during those initial weeks of stroke rehabilitation. This was another side project, but this time it was embedded in the trial by design instead of by accident. It was also my first experience of working in a hospital environment. To this day, I consider it an incredible privilege to be able to work with patients and their families who have experienced a stroke just a couple of days before we meet. The way that so many people are willing to give their time and energy to research at one of the most difficult times in their lives is incredibly humbling and something that we will never take for granted. The trial itself of the device was positive in that we found that priming physiotherapy sessions with the device accelerated the recovery of hand and arm function. And I could tell you more about that, but let's look instead at the side project on the algorithm. We found that the algorithm pretty much worked as we expected, but that the cutoff value for the MRI biomarker was just a little bit lower for these subacute patients than it was for the chronic patients. And this makes sense because of the neurodegeneration that occurs between the subacute and chronic stages. This study was also published in Brain in 2012, and I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Matt Pito, who was a postdoctoral fellow on the project, supported by the Stroke Foundation. Matt later joined the Bionics Institute in Melbourne, where he's been leading the Bionic Vision project. It's exactly as exciting as it sounds. It's amazing. Around this time, Suzanne Ackerley was completing her PhD with us, funded by the Neurological Foundation. Suzanne is a neurological physiotherapist, and she actually came up with the name PrEP for the algorithm. Thanks, Suze. It stands for Predict Recovery Potential. And now that we had developed the PrEP algorithm, we needed to validate it in a separate group of patients. I was fortunate to be funded by the HRC to do this with the TRIO study, and Suzanne worked on the project as a postdoctoral fellow. This was an ideal situation in that we had a trained neuroscientist coordinating the project who was also an experienced physiotherapist and an ADHB employee. This meant that Suze was really well placed to build relationships with our clinical colleagues in the acute stroke unit and the rehabilitation ward, and this facilitated patient recruitment and data collection. Having these tight links with the clinical teams has remained essential for our research activities ever since. For once, the algorithm was the main focus of the study instead of a side project. But hey, what is a project without a side project? So we embedded another prediction study inside to develop an algorithm for predicting recovery of walking after stroke called TWIST. Marie-Claire Smith was a senior physiotherapist at the time who had worked on the earlier clinical trial treating patients, and she was starting her PhD. So she ran this side project as well as carrying out experimental studies and gait training. The main TRIO project was very successful. In addition to validating the PrEP algorithm, it also evaluated the impact of using PrEP in clinical practice. We found that doing so increases therapist confidence, personalises upper limb therapy, and reduces the length of the patient's stay in hospital by about a week, probably because therapy better meets their needs. The study was published in Stroke in 2017, and this was at the time, and still is, the only study to evaluate the impact of using any prediction tools in stroke rehabilitation practice. We also combined the development and validation datasets to refine the PrEP algorithm to make it even easier to use in clinical practice. So PrEP 2 looks like this. We went sideways this time, a bit more sideways. And the main improvements are that you only need TMS for about a third of patients, and you don't need an MRI scan anymore. We found that all patients with a SAFE score of at least 5 do have a response to TMS. So that means we don't need to do the test with these patients. Only the people with a score less than 5 need the TMS test, and that's about a third of patients with upper limb symptoms. If the TMS test is positive and they have one of those MEP responses, then they're most likely to have a good outcome for their hand and arm, even though they can be profoundly weak with a SAFE score as low as 0. This is actually pretty cool, and it's very rewarding to tell a patient and their family that, look, things might look a bit grim for your hand and arm right now, but that connection still works. You can't use it yourself yet, but it is still there. So we think you've got great potential, so let's crack on, right? It's an amazing thing to be able to tell a patient and their family. We also found that a standard clinical assessment called the NIHSS was just as accurate as an MRI scan at discriminating between patients who would have a limited or poor outcome for their hand and arm. This is great because MRI scans are costly, and the skills involved in determining that MRI biomarker aren't available at many hospitals. A patient's outcome at 3 months after stroke is categorised according to their score on a standardised assessment of their hand and arm function. I hope that the category names give you a fairly intuitive sort of sense of what that function is likely to be like, and each category does come with a detailed description and recommended focus for hand and arm therapy. And it's this version of the algorithm that's now in use as part of routine clinical care at both Auckland and Waitemata DHBs. 10 years ago, a behavioural economist, Rima Vaithianathan, said to me, "Cathy, you'll know you've really got somewhere when you can walk into a hospital somewhere in the world and they're doing your thing and they've never heard of you." That is still my goal. Well, we're not there yet, but we are off to a good start. We're working with other DHBs in New Zealand and hospitals in Australia, the US, the UK, Europe and Asia as they begin implementing PrEP 2 in their practice as well. It's probably every clinical scientist's dream to create something that's used in the real world to help real patients. It feels pretty amazing to have got to this point in a relatively short space of time. I've learned a lot about implementation through this process and now teach implementation in healthcare at postgraduate level. Here's the main point. Having the idea, obtaining the funding, spending a few years carrying out the research, then publishing and presenting your findings is not the end. It's just the beginning. To really make a difference, you need to enable the application of the new knowledge and tools that you've created. Thanks, Dad. In the real world. Thanks, Olivia. People sometimes talk about research translation being from bench to bedside, as though doing research with patients is the final stage. But the next stage is the truly critical one, to get research into practice. And we've worked really hard as a group to facilitate the implementation of PrEP2 in partnership with the ADHB. Part of this has involved developing a training website where clinicians can find all of the education and training resources they need, like competency and clinical documentation, self-directed learning modules and quizzes, information they can give to their patients, as well as a recommended implementation plan with things like a calculator for their business plan and so on. I'd really like to thank the ADHB team, and particularly Emma Monagatti, Suzanne Ackley and Harry Jordan, who've just worked incredibly hard to share what we've learned and what we know with the world for free. It's all sitting there. It's amazing. Thanks, you guys. Using these resources, therapists are able to provide patients and families with accurate, objective information about what they can expect for their hand and arm recovery after stroke, for the first time. Until now, clinicians have used their experience and judgment to make these prognoses, but this can be a little bit problematic. A large study in the Netherlands asked therapists to predict the hand and arm outcome for each of their patients within days of stroke. Along the bottom is something called the ARAT score. This is the standard clinical assessment we use at 3 months post-stroke. High scores are good. It means your hand and arm are functioning well. You can see % correct on the y-axis. So these therapists had 3 categories to choose from: very impaired, perfect, or somewhere in the middle, which is a bit like saying, I don't know. I mean, the problem is that this middle category is so huge as to be meaningless. Making a prediction somewhere in here does not help the patient or the family, and it can't be used to guide your rehabilitation planning. Here's the therapist's accuracy for each of those 3 categories. And overall, the therapists were accurate 59% of the time. But they were no better than chance for this big middle category. Each therapist had more than 20 years clinical experience, but this experience didn't help. So you might think, well, maybe doctors could do a better job than that. Well, another very large study of over 30,000 patients with stroke in the US looked at where doctors sent patients from the acute hospital. And the options were home at the top, a rehabilitation facility, or a nursing facility where very little in the way of rehabilitation would take place. Between hospitals, there was a 3-fold variation in the rates of discharge to rehabilitation and nursing facilities, even when patient characteristics and the availability of these facilities were accounted for. This tells us that discharge decisions are highly variable, which means clinicians can't all be right every time when they're deciding who should go to rehab and who might benefit from rehabilitation. So it seems that not using a consistent and principled approach could be producing quite large variations in care, which probably result in inequitable access to rehabilitation. PrEP2 isn't perfect, but overall the predictions are correct for 75% of patients, which is better than clinical judgment for the hand and arm. It's actually 85% and 90% correct for patients who are predicted to have a limited or poor outcome for their hand and arm. Importantly, I think it lets clinical teams identify patients with initially severe impairment or weakness who do actually have potential for a good recovery. These people need to be identified early to ensure they have access to rehabilitation and can realise their full potential for recovery. Therapists sometimes avoid patients' questions about prognosis because they don't have a clear answer. I think we've shown that using PrEP2 predictions gives them a bit more information, and information that is useful. Being able to confidently tell a patient that they're most likely to have a good or excellent recovery is empowering for all concerned. But there's a flip side. What happens when the prognosis is for a limited or poor recovery? How do therapists convey this information in a way that is clear but not distressing? How do we look after our patients' hope? I think that if we can give accurate information to patients about what they can expect, then I think we ought to make that information available to them if they want it. We've worked with therapists and health psychologists to develop communication strategies for having these potentially difficult conversations. Avoiding the difficult conversations and letting people figure it out for themselves is just kicking the can down the road. If a patient leaves our care and then realises that the recovery they've been hoping for isn't going to happen, then we're not there to support them as they come to terms with this realisation. Having the conversation early in the rehabilitation process means we can support our patients' hope no matter what the prediction is. It's just that what they're hoping for and how they hope to achieve it might need to be adjusted depending on their brain's potential for recovery. And this can be done with kindness, compassion, and a sense of hope for the future as they work through the process of constructing their new sense of self. All of us involved in this work are keenly aware of our moral obligations and responsibilities. This is not easy work. You're probably wondering about the unicorns. Yeah, we're getting to that. Sometimes clinicians like to remind me that there's always someone who breaks the rules. Yeah. And it's true that some people do a little better or a little worse than their PrEP2 prediction would suggest. But when the algorithm is wrong, it's not wrong by much. We don't really see people with a limited or poor prognosis go on and have a good or excellent outcome because they can't. Once the corticospinal tract is damaged past a certain point, fine motor control of the hand is no longer possible. It's disappointing, but true, that we don't have any treatments yet that can repair this crucial pathway, and no amount of therapy or positive thinking will make the difference. The biological realities of the situation leave very little room for believing in unicorns. But I do believe that we can take what we've learned from developing, validating, and implementing PrEP2 and apply these skills to improving stroke care in other ways. Here's the journey so far that I've described tonight. We started back in 2007 with a side project with patients at the chronic stage, proposed PrEP, developed it in subacute patients, validated it in a separate group of subacute patients, revised it for clinical use, got invited to do another review for Lancet Neurology along the way, implemented it with an awful lot of help from the ADHB in their routine care, published about that, and have been working with Waitemata DHB implementing it there. Oh, and the last bit is that we just recently published a study showing that these predictions are accurate for about 80% of patients 2 years after their stroke. So we're making predictions within a few days that hold true, even 2 years later. It's good. But where are we going from here? My dream is to build an implementation hub to turn best evidence into best practice as quickly as we can for the benefit of people with stroke throughout the country. And we are off to a good start. In addition to helping other DHBs and hospitals implement PrEP2, we're also refining the algorithm and understanding the patient experience with further research. Olivia Norrie is an ADHB physiotherapist who's carrying out the PrEP2 Validation and Practice, VIP study, with a fellowship from the Neurological Foundation. Remember the walking prediction study I mentioned with Marie-Claire Smith? Well, she developed the TWIST algorithm for predicting time to walking independently after stroke. This is a relatively simple algorithm for predicting not just whether, but when a patient will be able to walk safely on their own again. This information is so valuable because the ability to walk independently determines whether you're able to return home or need maybe to move to a more supported living environment. Knowing in advance what to expect and how long the patient will need support will help clinicians with discharge planning, as well as helping patients and families to more confidently make decisions about their future. Maybe they won't need to sell the family home after all. You don't know. We're just over halfway through a multi-centre validation study of TWIST, thanks to support from the Neurological Foundation and the Auckland Academic Health Alliance. Marie-Claire's managing the project, and we're pleased to have Ben Scrivener and Luke Skinner, physiotherapists at Auckland and Waitemata DHBs, working with us, as well as Christine Mangold, who works on several of our projects as a research therapist. Once TWIST is validated, we'll begin developing and testing an implementation strategy for national rollout. That's exciting. We've also got plans to evaluate and implement a tool for predicting swallowing function after stroke. It's exciting to be getting away from arms and legs, and I'm thrilled to be working with Dr. Anna Miles on this project. We think that this prediction tool will help clinicians make timely decisions about whether a patient needs tube feeding and whether that's likely to be temporary or permanent. We also want to improve feedback from the community team to the inpatient teams about discharge decisions and develop service specifications for return to work services for people after stroke. So, there's no resting on any laurels. Instead, being promoted to professor encourages me to dream big and pursue these plans. This will be a team effort, and I work with some amazing people. Here are some of us at last year's Christmas lunch, and many of you are here tonight. I hope you share my optimism about where we can go together. I'd like to thank all of you again for coming along tonight. It's amazing to see so many friendly faces in one place. Thank you for your support. There are also a few specific people I'd like to thank, starting with my mum and dad. Hi. You set such a great example of living life to the full. Thanks for giving me every opportunity you could and for always believing in me. Thanks. It's just so great to see so many of your oldest and dearest friends here too. Thank you so much for coming, particularly David, my third parent. Thank you for a lifetime of caring. Andy, Rich and Karina, thank you so much for being here tonight and for making our family such a fun and happy thing to be a part of. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Alan, for being such a great mentor, sponsor and colleague. I've learned a lot from you about keeping things in perspective and good sentence construction. Yeah. My draft manuscripts seem to need a bit less alienating and barbarising now, which is a relief. And finally, Winston. It's hard to find the words to say just how grateful I am. You're my all-time favourite person, and I love this adventure that we're on together. Thank you for everything. It's such a privilege to do what we do, and I'd like to end with a few favourite words. There is no immortality that is not built on friendship and work done with care. Thanks.
Can't see you from there. Good evening. I'm Alan Merry. I'm Deputy Dean of the faculty. You're probably, like me, in a state of just astonishment at an extraordinary lecture from Professor Cathy Stinear. What an amazing, starting with my shared passion for Auckland. Auckland is indeed such an amazing city, and we are lucky to live in this extraordinary place. I never fail to think that. But what a journey what a talk from a chiropractor from the circus who can fly loop the loop through the corticospinal tract and the other complexities of neuroscience. Astonishing. But it actually opens up a very interesting point which parents need to note. There is only one thing to do in bringing children up, and that is getting them to the point of brain maturity safely. What they do on the route really doesn't matter, or perhaps it does. Perhaps going the alternative route is in fact a predictor of success, because I've seen it before, and it is remarkable. So we've heard about extraordinary work about prediction of the outcome of strokes. Strokes are probably the most feared, one of the most anyway, feared things that we face. I'm an anaesthetist actually, and I've had so many patients say to me, in effect, I don't mind if I die, doctor, but please don't let me have a stroke, which of course I can't manage for them. But that choice, I can't manage the choice for them. But it is really a very, very frightening thing. And I think it's extraordinary that your work is the first work to accurately predict outcomes from stroke and to lift the prediction from really no better than chance in the hand of clinicians to better than 75% and better than that still in some circumstances. And I think what we've heard today is, as is the case really with so many, if not all, our academics, is that this academia is not about ivory towers. We've heard about a partnership with our hospitals, ADHB and Waitemata. We've heard about the patients and providing hope, supporting hope, and perhaps resetting hope for patients. And I think that is absolutely inspiring. It is inspiring, I am sure, for our students when they hear you give lectures of this quality. I'm sure it is inspiring for the patients and the people you work with. And this evening, I think it has been completely inspiring for all of us. So, Professor Stinear, welcome to the Professoriate. Thank you for a brilliant lecture. And I invite everybody to join me in congratulating you once again.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Alan. And of course, thank you, Professor Stinear, for a wonderful lecture. It's only left to me to close this evening's ceremony and invite you all. I believe there is some more food and drinks outside, so please stay around and chat. But also to remind you that on Thursday we have our second inaugural lecture, Professor Benedict Fisher, who is one of our imports. His expertise is in addiction research, and he's working very busily at the moment advising government on the referendum around legalisation of marijuana, so it will be a very, very interesting talk. So it's really just left to me to thank you all for coming tonight. Wonderful lecture. Mā te atua kutu hei mana aki. Haere tu atu hoki tu mai. Noho rā, mai rā. May God bless and protect. Go well. Return in good health. Leave you all in good health. Thank you.
so much. So are you going to be doing Thursday night?
I have to talk to Anthony about it.
Thank you, I appreciate you.
There's another USB inside here, so
Her USB?
I
Okay.
think so, because it wasn't there when I was putting in my USB. I just left it.
I'll put it with her. Thank you. You're awesome.